Picture this. You're scrolling through the news one ordinary morning when you see a face that makes your blood run cold. It's your father. The father you buried 5 years ago. The father you cried over, mourned, and said goodbye to forever. Except he's not dead. He's standing in a police station, very much alive, asking to be helped because he claims he has amnesia. This isn't a horror movie. This isn't fiction. This is the absolutely insane true story of John Darwin, the man who faked his own death and got caught in the most ridiculous way possible. But before I tell you how spectacularly this plan fell apart, let me take you back to where it all began, because the truth is always stranger than fiction, and this story has more twists than a roller coaster. Let me take you back to March 21st, 2002, in Canoe, a small coastal town in northeast England. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the sea crashes against the shore with a relentless rhythm, and where nothing exciting ever really happens. Until it did. John Darwin was a 51-year-old prison officer living what looked like a normal life with his wife, Anne. They had 2 adult sons, Mark and Anthony, a house by the sea with a beautiful ocean view, and from the outside, everything seemed absolutely fine. John went to work every day at the prison. Anne worked as a doctor's receptionist. They seemed like your typical middle-aged couple settling into their golden years. But behind closed doors, behind the curtains of that seaside house, the Darwins were drowning in debt. And I don't mean a little credit card debt or a missed payment here and there. I'm talking about £200,000 worth of crushing, suffocating, life-destroying financial disaster. That's roughly $250,000 in American currency, and back in 2002, that was an astronomical amount of debt for a middle-class family. How did they get into this mess? Well, like many people who end up in financial ruin, it started with a dream that seemed too good to be true. John and Anne had become obsessed with the idea of becoming property moguls. They watched all those real estate investment shows on TV, read the books, attended the seminars, and convinced themselves they discovered the secret to wealth. Buy rental properties, collect rent, watch the money roll in. Easy, right? Wrong. So very, very wrong. The Darwins borrowed money from banks, maxed out credit cards, took out loans against their home, and bought 13, yes, 13, rental properties they absolutely could not afford. They were banking on property values skyrocketing and rental income covering all their costs. Instead, property values stagnated, tenants didn't always pay, maintenance costs ate into their profits, and the mortgage payments kept coming like waves crashing on the shore, relentless and unforgiving. John lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to Anne's breathing beside him, calculating numbers in his head over and over again. No matter how he added them up, they didn't work. Bankruptcy was coming. It was inevitable. And bankruptcy meant losing everything: their house, their rental properties, John's prison pension that he'd worked decades to earn, their dignity, their standing in the community. John was a prison officer. He'd spent years watching criminals, studying them, learning how they thought. And somewhere in those dark, desperate nights, an idea began to form in his mind. An idea so crazy, so desperate, so audacious that it just might work. What if he simply disappeared? Dead men don't have debts. Dead men don't face bankruptcy. And dead men come with life insurance payouts that could solve everything. John began researching. He discovered that if a person went missing and their body was never found, they could be declared legally dead after a certain period. And if they were declared dead, life insurance policies would pay out. The more John thought about it, the more perfect it seemed. He was a canoeist. He went out on the North Sea regularly. Canoeing accidents happened all the time. Bodies washed out to sea were often never recovered. It was plausible. It was believable. It could work. But there was one problem. John couldn't do this alone. He needed Anne's cooperation. He needed her to play the grieving widow, to file the insurance claims, to keep up the lie. So one night, John sat Anne down and told her his plan. I wish I could tell you that Anne was horrified, that she refused, that she talked her husband out of this insane idea. But she didn't. Anne, facing the same financial devastation, the same crushing debt, the same fear of losing everything, agreed. They would do this together. On that cold March morning in 2002, John Darwin woke up early. He kissed his wife goodbye, a kiss that held the weight of the enormous lie they were about to tell. He grabbed his red canoe from the garage, the same canoe he'd paddled dozens of times before, and carried it down to the beach. Anne watched from the window as her husband paddled out into the North Sea. The morning mist clung to the water, swallowing John's figure until he disappeared completely. According to their plan, John would paddle around the coast to a secluded spot, hide the canoe, and make his way back to their secret property next door. The stage was set. Hours passed. Lunchtime came and went. Anne waited, rehearsing her lines, preparing her face for the performance of her life. Finally, in the early afternoon, she picked up the phone and called the police, her voice shaking with carefully practiced worry. My husband went out canoeing this morning, she told the emergency dispatcher, her voice breaking at just the right moments. He should have been back hours ago. Something's wrong. Please, you have to help me find him. The response was immediate and massive. The Coast Guard launched a full-scale search and rescue operation. Helicopters thundered overhead, their searchlights scanning the gray waters of the North Sea. Rescue boats cut through the waves, their crews scanning the horizon for any sign of John Darwin. Volunteers combed the beaches, calling his name into the wind. Anne stood on the shore, wrapped in a blanket provided by the Coast Guard, watching the search with tears streaming down her face. She played her part perfectly. The worried wife, the devastated partner, the woman who couldn't believe this was happening. And then they found it, the wreckage of John's canoe, smashed to pieces against the rocks, along with a paddle floating in the water and a piece of his clothing snagged on some debris. The evidence told a clear and tragic story. John Darwin had capsized in the rough waters, and the sea had claimed him. The search continued for several more days, but as time passed and no body was found, hope faded. The conclusion seemed obvious and inevitable. John Darwin had drowned in a tragic canoeing accident. His body had been swept out to sea, likely never to be found. It was sad, it was tragic, but it happened. The North Sea was unforgiving. The police closed the case. Anne Darwin officially became a widow, and their sons, Mark and Anthony, were completely devastated, utterly destroyed by the loss of their father. They had no idea, absolutely no idea, that their father was alive, that he'd orchestrated this entire thing, that their grief was based on an elaborate lie. There was just one small problem with this tragic story. John Darwin wasn't dead. He was alive, and he was hiding in the house right next door. Here's where this story goes from tragic to absolutely mind-blowingly bizarre. You see, the Darwins owned the house next door to their family home. They'd bought it as an investment property and converted it into several rental bedsits, small studio apartments. After his death, John simply moved into one of these bedsits and lived there in secret. Think about how absolutely insane this is. Let it really sink in. John Darwin spent the next 5.5 years living next door to his family home. Not in another city, not in another country, next door. Separated from his old life by a single wall. He could hear everything, every conversation, every visitor, every moment of grief. When his sons came to visit their mother, John was in the next room, sometimes just feet away, separated only by a thin wall. He listened to Mark and Anthony crying, talking about their dead father, sharing memories of him, struggling with their loss. He heard them wonder what his final moments were like, whether he suffered, whether he thought of them as he drowned. Imagine the psychology of this. Imagine hearing your own children grieve for you when you're alive and breathing on the other side of a wall. Most people couldn't do it. Most people would break, would run out and reveal themselves, would end the charade because the guilt would be too overwhelming. But John Darwin didn't. He stayed hidden. He stayed quiet. He let his sons suffer. Anne would bring him food under the cover of darkness. They developed an elaborate system of signals, specific knocks on the wall that meant coast is clear or someone's here, hide. They had specific times when it was safe for John to move around, to use the bathroom, to stretch his legs. During the day, especially when potential renters came to view the property, John would hide in a secret cupboard they'd built specifically for this purpose. He'd crouch in there for hours sometimes, barely breathing, waiting for the danger to pass. At night, when they were certain no one would see, John would sneak into his old house through a connecting door they'd installed between the two properties. He'd sleep in his own bed next to Anne, eat at his own kitchen table, watch his own TV. Then, before dawn, he'd slip back into his hiding place like a ghost, disappearing before the world woke up. For 5.5 years, this was John Darwin's life. A prisoner in his own home, a ghost haunting his own existence, living in approximately 150 square feet of space, unable to go outside during the day, unable to exist as himself. It sounds like a prison sentence, which is ironic considering John's career had been spent as a prison officer. He'd essentially built himself a jail cell and locked himself inside. But while John was living this bizarre, claustrophobic existence, Anne was busy collecting the insurance money. And let me tell you, the payouts were substantial. First came the £25,000 from John's prison service pension, a death benefit paid to widows. Anne filed the paperwork, played the grieving widow, and collected the check. Then came £137,000 from a life insurance policy John had taken out years earlier. Anne cried in the insurance office as she signed the papers. Another check deposited. Then came the big one, £250,000 from an endowment policy. In total, over the course of several years, Anne Darwin collected more than £500,000 by claiming her husband was dead. That's over $625,000, more than $500,000. The debt that had seemed so insurmountable was now completely paid off, with plenty left over. The plan had worked. Against all odds, they'd actually pulled it off. John Darwin was legally dead. The insurance companies had paid out, the debts were cleared, and nobody suspected a thing. But here's the thing about living a lie. It's exhausting. The human psyche isn't built to sustain deception indefinitely. Cracks start to form. The weight becomes unbearable. And eventually, greed starts to whisper in your ear. After years of hiding in a tiny bedsit, John got restless. He was alive, but he wasn't living. He had money, but he couldn't spend it, couldn't enjoy it, couldn't do anything with it because officially he didn't exist. What was the point of having over $500,000 if you had to spend your life hiding in a cupboard? John wanted more. He wanted to actually live. He wanted sunshine, freedom, adventure. He wanted to enjoy the fruits of his elaborate deception. And Anne, worn down by years of lying to her sons, years of playing the widow, years of living this double life, wanted something too. She wanted to be free of the lie. She wanted to start over somewhere fresh, somewhere they could both exist openly. So they came up with a new plan, one that would allow them to escape England and start fresh. They would move abroad and build a new life together. In 2006, 4 years after John's death, Anne Darwin started preparing for the next phase of their scheme. She put their properties up for sale, telling friends and family that she needed a fresh start, that living by the sea with all its memories of John was too painful. Everyone understood. Everyone sympathized. Nobody suspected that the real reason was to liquidate their assets and prepare for a new life abroad. Anne bought a one-way ticket to Panama. Why Panama? Well, the Darwins had done their research. Panama had friendly policies for foreign retirees, a lower cost of living, beautiful weather, and most importantly, it was far away from England, where someone might recognize John. It seemed like paradise, and it seemed safe. Anne flew to Panama City and started house hunting. She found a beautiful apartment with an ocean view, which she purchased using the insurance money. She told her son she was exploring, maybe thinking of retiring abroad eventually. Mark and Anthony, still grieving their father, were happy their mother was finally starting to move forward with her life. Meanwhile, back in England, John was preparing for the most dangerous part of their plan. He needed to leave the country, but he couldn't do it as John Darwin. John Darwin was dead. He needed a new identity. This is where John's years of hiding and research paid off. He'd managed to obtain a fraudulent passport under the name John Jones. The methods he used to get this fake identity involved exploiting gaps in the British passport system at the time, finding the birth certificate of someone who died young, and essentially stealing that person's identity. It was illegal, it was risky, but he pulled it off. In 2006, John Jones boarded a plane to Panama and reunited with his wife in their new tropical paradise. After more than 4 years of hiding, John Darwin was finally free. He could walk outside. He could feel sunshine on his face. He could exist again. And for a while, a brief, glorious while, it seemed like they'd actually gotten away with it. The Darwins lived in Panama City, enjoying their ill-gotten wealth. They bought that beautiful apartment. They explored the country. They even invested in a plot of tropical land, dreaming of building a hotel and resort for canoeing and wildlife enthusiasts. The irony is almost too perfect. A man who died canoeing wanting to open a canoe resort in his new life. They made friends with other expats. They learned Spanish. They ate fresh seafood and watched spectacular sunsets over the Pacific. They had money, they had freedom, and they had each other. For John and Anne Darwin, it must have felt like they'd found paradise. But paradise had a serpent, and that serpent was guilt. Anne missed her sons desperately. Mark and Anthony still believed their father was dead. They'd moved on with their lives, getting married, having children, building careers, but they'd done it all without their father, believing he was gone forever. Anne had grandchildren she could only see through brief visits to England, grandchildren who would never know their grandfather because he was supposedly dead. The weight of the lie was crushing Anne. She'd call her sons from Panama, and they'd ask how she was doing, if she was lonely, if she'd found peace. Every conversation was a knife to her heart. She'd created this elaborate web of deceit that had trapped her just as surely as it had trapped John all those years in the bedsit. John, on the other hand, was getting restless again. Living under a fake identity meant constantly looking over his shoulder, constantly worried about being recognized. He couldn't truly relax. He couldn't truly be himself. And he started to think, what if there was a way to come back? That's when they hatched their final, most audacious plan. A plan so ridiculous, so obviously doomed to fail, that it's almost hard to believe they tried it. They would claim amnesia. John would return to England and say he'd been wandering for years, that he had no memory of who he was or where he'd been, and that his memory had just suddenly, miraculously returned. Anne would joyfully reunite with her not-dead husband. The insurance companies would chalk it up to an incredible miracle. Rare, but not unheard of. People do occasionally turn up after being missing for years. The Darwins would say they had no idea they'd been paid life insurance. They'd offered to return the money, and maybe, just maybe, they'd get to keep their freedom and be reunited with their sons. It was a terrible plan. It relied on too many people believing something too unbelievable. But after years of successfully deceiving everyone, John and Anne Darwin had become overconfident. They'd fooled the Coast Guard, the police, insurance investigators, their own children. Why wouldn't this work? So on December 1st, 2007, John Darwin walked into a London police station and said something absolutely remarkable. I think I'm a missing person. I can't remember where I've been. The media went absolutely crazy. Canoe man returns from the dead, the headlines screamed. Missing canoeist found alive after 5 years. It was an international story, appearing on news broadcasts around the world. The man who drowned in the North Sea, whose body had never been found, had mysteriously reappeared with no memory of where he'd been. Reporters swarmed Anne's house. Camera crews camped outside. Everyone wanted the story of the miraculous return. Anne, following their plan, expressed shock and joy. She told reporters she couldn't believe it, that she'd mourned her husband, that this was a miracle. John's sons, Mark and Anthony, rushed to see their father. Imagine that moment. Imagine seeing your dead father walking toward you, alive and breathing. The shock, the confusion, the overwhelming emotion. Both sons were in tears, hugging their father, unable to process what was happening. Their father, who they'd buried in their hearts 5 years ago, was alive. But even in that emotional moment, something felt off. Mark and Anthony would later say they noticed strange things. Their father seemed uncomfortable. His story didn't quite add up. He claimed total amnesia, but seemed to have very specific memories about certain things. Where had he been living? How had he survived? Why was he in such good physical health for someone who'd supposedly been wandering with no memory for years? The police had questions too. Lots of questions. Where had John been for 5.5 years? How did he survive? Where did he sleep? What did he eat? John's answers were vague and contradictory. He said he didn't remember anything, but then he'd slip up and mention specific details. He said he'd been wandering, but he looked well-fed and well cared for, not like someone who'd been homeless for years. Insurance investigators were especially skeptical. They'd paid out over £500,000, and now the supposedly dead man was back? That was more than suspicious. That was alarm bells ringing at full volume. They started their own investigation, interviewing Anne, examining financial records, looking for anything that didn't add up. And then a detective assigned to the case did something so simple, so basic, that it's almost embarrassing. This is how the whole scheme came crashing down. This detective, sitting at her computer, decided to do a quick internet search. She opened Google and typed, John Darwin, Panama. And there it was, the photograph that destroyed everything. On a Panamanian real estate website, in the archives of a property agency's blog from July 2006, was a photograph. In this photo, taken more than 4 years after John Darwin's supposed death, John Darwin stood smiling next to his wife Anne and a cheerful Panamanian real estate agent. All three were posing in front of a property. John looked healthy, happy, very much alive, and very much not suffering from amnesia. The photograph was dated, time-stamped, and geotagged. There was no explaining it away. No amnesia story could account for it. John Darwin had been in Panama with his wife, buying property, while he was supposed to be legally dead or mysteriously wandering with no memory. When the police confronted John with the photograph, his face drained of color. The amnesia story evaporated in an instant. There was no more pretending, no more lying. The whole elaborate scheme collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Anne was arrested the next day as she returned to England from Panama. The truth came spilling out in the ugliest possible way during police interrogations. The fake drowning, the years of hiding next door, the insurance fraud, the move to Panama, the fake passport, all of it. But the most devastating revelation wasn't about the money or the fraud. It was about Mark and Anthony. The police asked Anne point blank, "Did your sons know about this?" And Anne, perhaps seeking some redemption, perhaps finally unburdening herself of the guilt, said no. Her sons had known nothing. They had genuinely believed their father was dead. They had genuinely grieved. When Mark and Anthony learned the truth, not just that their father was alive, but that both their parents had orchestrated this elaborate fraud, that they'd let them grieve for years, that their father had been hiding next door listening to them cry, the betrayal was absolute and devastating. The media circus that followed was intense and merciless. The Darwins became tabloid fixtures, their every move scrutinized and mocked. The British public was fascinated and appalled in equal measure. How could parents do this to their children? How could someone listen to their own sons grieving through a wall and not come forward? What kind of people were John and Anne Darwin? Anthony Darwin gave a gut-wrenching interview to reporters where he said, "My father is dead to me now. He died 5 years ago when he paddled out to sea. I mourned him once. I've already said goodbye. I won't mourn him again, and I won't forgive him." The pain in his voice was palpable, raw, and heartbreaking. Mark Darwin was equally devastated, but even more direct. In his own interview, he said, "How could he listen to us crying through the walls? What kind of person does that? What kind of father lets his sons suffer like that when he could have ended it at any moment? I don't have a father anymore. I have a stranger who looks like him, but the man I knew wouldn't have done this. That man really did die." The trial began in 2008 and became a media sensation. Every detail of the Darwins' elaborate deception was laid bare in court. The jury heard about the bedsit hideaway, the secret knocks on the wall, the years of fraud, the Panama property, the fake passport, everything. John Darwin tried to claim during the trial that he'd acted alone, that Anne was an innocent victim who'd been coerced into helping him. It was a last-ditch attempt to protect his wife, but it didn't work. The evidence showed clearly that Anne had been a willing and active participant from the beginning. She'd filed the insurance claims, collected the money, moved to Panama, bought property. She'd been in on it from day one. The prosecution painted a picture of a greedy, selfish couple who'd put money above everything else, including their own children's well-being. The defense tried to portray them as desperate people driven to extremes by financial pressure, but it was a hard sell. After all, they hadn't just faked John's death. They'd let their sons grieve unnecessarily for years, even after the debts were paid. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Their verdict? Guilty on all counts of fraud. John Darwin was sentenced to 6 years and 3 months in prison. Anne Darwin received 6.5 years, slightly longer because the judge felt she'd had more opportunity to come clean and hadn't. Both were ordered to pay back every penny of the insurance money they'd stolen, plus interest and legal costs. But the legal consequences, as severe as they were, paled in comparison to the personal ones. Mark and Anthony Darwin made a decision that must have been agonizing, but in their minds, necessary. They cut off all contact with their father. Completely, totally. John Darwin had chosen money over his family, and now he would live with the consequences of that choice.